There are a number of changes that have been going on. Some of them are quite visible, some of them are under the surface in the last 20 years or so ago that have really changed the landscape within which business operates dramatically. You can trace these changes back to around the year 1989 or the year 1990, roughly in that time frame. A number of things that happened around that time. One of the most significant things that happened, first of all, we had the collapse of communism. Right, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and this was a very dramatic turning point in the history, certainly of the 20th century, which was defined by that ideological battle between these competing philosophies about how we should live and how we should operate in terms of our commercial lives. So free markets and free people, essentially won that debate over the alternative. And the issue then became not a question of should we have free markets and free people, but really what are the nuances within that? What kind of free markets? To what degree are they regulated? What is the purpose of businesses? How do we charter them as societies and so forth? So that's part of the evolution. Now we've moved into thinking the nuances within that system as opposed to arguing the benefits of two completely different systems. The other thing that happened around that time frame, in the year 1990, the United States, actually 1989, for the first time, the median age of adults in this country crossed 40. So there were more adults over the age of 40 than there were below. And that number has continued to rise here as it has in Western Europe and Japan and virtually every industrialized developed country in the world, and many that are still in fact developing. Birth rates have been plummeting dramatically over the last many decades. Now, what does that imply in terms of the value systems of society is very interesting. We have a construct we call the psychological center of gravity, which reflects the median age of adults plus minus 5 years. And that's really becomes the default value system of society as a whole. So when most adults are in midlife and beyond in a society, the values of society are going to mirror that. Now, what are the values of midlife? There really is a much greater concern, not with the individual and with the self-interest, but with the community. There's a much greater sense of interconnection. There's a much greater feeling or need to give back, to be of service and value to others. There's a greater emphasis on spiritual kinds of questions. Who am I really? What is my purpose? Is this all there is? What legacy am I going to leave behind? These are some of the questions that people start to think about in the second half of life. The field of developmental psychology tells us that we keep evolving as we go through life. It's not that once we become adults, we are set. And so it continues. So the complexion of society changes quite dramatically. So if you look at a society like Japan, where the median age of adults is actually close to 50 or in the early 50s, or Western Europe, where it's in the high 40s, it's very different. It's a much less aggressive societies in sense of using military power and things of that sort. I mean, all of these things go hand in hand. The other thing that happens when people age is that they tend to rise, especially in relatively prosperous economies, that they tend to move up what we know as the Maslow hierarchy of needs. So people are more motivated by higher level needs. It's not just physical comforts or safety and security, it's really more love and esteem and ultimately self-actualization, as Maslow referred to. So people are more motivated by higher level needs than they were in the past, which means that they're looking for more out of life in every aspect, including the businesses that they work for and the companies that they buy from and the other companies that they allow into their communities, etc. So they have a different lens with which they view all those things, which means that businesses have to change, otherwise they will not get the business or the loyalty of this group. The third major thing that happened was the invention of the internet. Around the year 1990, Tim Berners-Lee, or 91, invented the World Wide Web. So the internet has been around for decades, but the idea of the World Wide Web was created around that time. And you could argue that this invention has had a greater impact on humanity than almost any other invention for centuries. And that Tim Berners-Lee himself has been responsible for changing the world more than many of the giants of the 20th century. What has the internet done? Of course, it has provided access to information for virtually free, instantaneously, to almost everybody in the world. I mean, that the proportion of people with access to that is growing rapidly. So it has created an information democracy. It has democratized information, which means that people now know a lot more about what companies are doing than what companies know about people. We live now in a transparent world. There's almost anything that a company does will be made public, especially if it's controversial or negative. So Don Tapscott wrote a book a few years ago called The Naked Corporation, in which he said all corporations live with glass walls. If there's something you're doing today that you don't want to see on the front page of the New York Times tomorrow, then you probably should not be doing it. So that creates a built-in mechanism of checks on corporate behavior. Now, of course, some companies are still able to get away and do certain things that, especially when there are things that people don't understand, all the derivatives and the hedge fund, hardly anybody understands what exactly goes on there. But for most businesses, if it's a question of discriminating against certain employees or dumping of chemicals or price, those kinds of things come out, and therefore there's a mechanism. So people now care about more things, and people know much more, and they're connected to each other through the internet. Now people, hundreds of millions, even billions of people are connected to each other on issues that they care about. Facebook alone has about 200 million members now and growing, and many other sites of that kind have similar numbers. So that's another big change. The fourth big change, and again some of these are gradual and have been going on for decades, but we just start to see them become much more visible now, is what I call the feminization of the culture. The so-called feminine attributes are present in all people. So all of us, men and women, are born with feminine and so-called feminine and masculine traits. Of course, in men, the masculine traits of aggression and competitive instincts and those kinds of things tend to dominate, where with women it's nurturing, caring, thinking about long-term, those kinds of things tend to be more dominant. What's happening in society as a whole is that the feminine attributes are becoming more prominent. And it's happening for a couple of reasons. One has to do with aging. What happens to people over their lifetime, what happens to men as they age, is that their feminine side becomes more prominent. They become less aggressive, more driven, less competitive, and in fact more caring, compassionate, nurturing, etc. That's just a normal change that goes. Part of it is hormonal, part of it is also life experience. So I think we all see it in our fathers and grandfathers, etc., that they mellow over time. They become much more willing to show emotion, caring, loving, those kinds of things, and less aggressive. Women, on the other hand, as they age, tend to, in fact, become more independent, more confident, and more willing to state what's actually on their mind. And they actually become, and they don't lose the feminine approach to life that they've always had, but they tend to now be more confident in their approach and be willing to speak out. And in society as a whole, if you look at the role of women, especially in the white-collar professions, it is poised to grow dramatically. Women now make up 60% of undergraduate enrollments in this country, close to 60%, and about 70% of graduate school enrollments. And they tend to do better than the average male students. So over time, we expect to see that most white-collar professions are going to come to be dominated by women, and moving up the ladder at the highest levels of these. So we start to see now a lot of CEOs. We're starting to see a lot of senators. So every sphere of life, in government, in other institutions, NGOs, in businesses, in education, everywhere, we're going to see more and more women in prominent roles of leadership. And the women who rise to these positions today are very different than the ones who rose, the very few who rose to those positions, say, 30 years ago. In those days, if you think back to people like Margaret Thatcher and Indira Gandhi and Golda Meir and the few CEOs that we could point to, the only way they could succeed in the world at that time was by being more manly, so to speak, than the toughest men. So Indira Gandhi was called the toughest man in her own cabinet, and Margaret Thatcher was the Iron Lady. Right? That's no longer true. The leaders we're starting to see today, whether it's Anne Mulcahy at Xerox or Indra Nooyi at PepsiCo, and Terry Kelly at W.L. Gore, and Sally Jewell at REI, are very, very comfortable in their approach to leadership and the values of nurturing and caring and compassion brought into the business world, and with relation to all of their stakeholders, than we've seen in the past. And therefore, all of these things put together really help contribute to this trend towards conscious capitalism. What we say, there was a billboard I saw in New York City a few months ago from careerbuilder.com. It said, if your company cared, it would be in the caring business. And the message being that most companies don't care, and you better watch out for yourself, right? And come to careerbuilder.com and find a better job. But the message going forward, we believe very strongly, is that if your company doesn't care, it will no longer be in business. your company better care not only about your customers, but also your employees and your environmental impact and your broader societal impact. And of course, you have to care about being financially viable as well. I mean, we're not arguing against profits. As I mentioned earlier, these companies are highly profitable. They're very successful, and that's what enables them to continue to grow and do even more wonderful things. But they're creating a lot of hidden wealth and value that's not even captured in their fairly dramatic financial numbers.